At just 14 years old, Jada Reynolds is arrested, thrown into a jail cell, and put on trial for a crime she didn't commit. The evidence is weak, the prosecutor is ruthless, and the system is stacked against her. She's supposed to lose. But Jada isn't going down without a fight. Will she prove her innocence? Or will the system crush her before she even gets the chance? Watch until the end to find out. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from today. If you love powerful stories like this, subscribe to Inspiring Stories Told and never miss one. The night air was thick and humid, clinging to Jada Reynolds' skin as she walked home from her best friend's house. The dim glow of a single street lamp barely lit the cracked sidewalk beneath her worn sneakers. She wasn't in a hurry. Her mom had told her to be back by 10, and she still had a few minutes to spare. But the silence in the neighborhood felt heavy, unnatural. Then came the sudden burst of sirens. Bright red and blue lights flooded the street, turning everything into a chaotic blur. Before Jada could react, 3 police cars skidded to a stop in front of her, doors flying open as uniformed men stormed toward her like hunters closing in on prey. "Don't move," one of them barked, his voice sharp like a blade cutting through the thick summer air. Jada barely had time to gasp before strong hands grabbed her shoulders and shoved her face first onto the pavement. Her cheek scraped against the rough asphalt, stinging as she let out a sharp cry. "I didn't do anything," she choked out, her voice muffled by the weight pressing down on her back. The officer's knee dug into the small of her spine, crushing the breath from her lungs. "Shut up," he growled. The cold bite of steel wrapped around her wrists, squeezing them tight. The world tilted violently as they yanked her up, forcing her onto unsteady legs. Jada's heart pounded against her ribs, her breath coming in ragged gasps. This wasn't real. It couldn't be real. Neighbors peeked out of their windows. Some even stood on their porches, arms folded, watching in silence. No one spoke. No one moved to help. They just stared. "Jada." Her mother's voice tore through the night like a bullet. Angela Reynolds sprinted from their house, her face twisted in pure panic. "What are you doing?" "That's my daughter. Get your hands off her." Angela ran toward them, but an officer stepped in her path, shoving her back with one hand. "She's under arrest," the officer sneered, his lip curling. "For what?" Angela shrieked. Jada's head was spinning. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think. Everything was happening too fast. One of the officers, a tall man with a thick mustache and a smirk that made her skin crawl, turned to Angela. "Your little girl's a thief," he said, his voice oozing with condescension. Angela froze, her chest rising and falling rapidly. "What? No, you have the wrong person. She didn't do anything." The mustached officer chuckled, like this was some kind of sick joke. "Surveillance footage says otherwise." Jada's stomach plummeted. This wasn't a mistake. They weren't going to let her go. This was really happening. Thrown into the system, the ride to the station was a blur of flashing lights and the suffocating stench of sweat and stale leather. The back seat was hard, the cuffs digging into her skin every time the car jolted. Jada's mind raced, desperately grasping for answers. How could they think she had stolen anything? She hadn't even been near a jewelry store. By the time they yanked her out of the cruiser and dragged her into the precinct, her legs felt like lead. The inside of the station was freezing, the air conditioning cranked too high, as if meant to make people as uncomfortable as possible. The scent of coffee, old paper, and something metallic lingered in the air. They shoved her into a metal chair, chaining her wrist to the table like she was some kind of violent criminal. Hours passed. The walls seemed to close in on her, the buzzing fluorescent light overhead drilling into her skull. Her body ached from the rough handling, her wrists red and swollen. But she refused to cry. Then the door creaked open. A man walked in, his belly stretching the buttons of his beige shirt, his skin slick with sweat. He had the kind of face that looked like he was always chewing something sour. Detective Carl Whitaker. He leaned in too close, his breath a mix of coffee and tobacco. "You're going away, sweetheart," he said, his lips curling into a cruel smile. "Might as well confess now and make it easier on yourself." Jada stared at him, her jaw clenched so tight it hurt. I didn't do anything. Whitaker's smile widened, but his eyes stayed cold. See, that's where you're wrong. He tossed a file onto the table. You got caught, sweetheart. Surveillance footage. Witnesses. A whole lot of bad luck. He flipped the folder open, revealing grainy black and white photos. Jada's stomach twisted. The images showed a hooded figure inside a jewelry store, reaching toward a display case. Their face was obscured. That's not me, she said, her voice firm but tight. Whitaker chuckled, shaking his head. Sure looks like you. She clenched her fist beneath the table. I want a lawyer. Whitaker threw his head back and laughed, a deep, mocking sound that made her skin crawl. Oh, honey, you think this is TV? He leaned forward, his breath hitting her face. You're not getting out of this. We know you were there. We have a witness. We have the video. And I bet if we check your house, we'll find that pretty little necklace you stole. Jada's heart slammed against her ribs. Necklace? She didn't even own any jewelry. They were making things up. Her breath came faster now, but she forced herself to stay calm. They wanted her to break. She wouldn't. Another officer walked in, a woman with sharp eyes and a clipboard. Charges are in, she said. Felony theft and property destruction. Felony. Jada's skin went cold. Whitaker grinned like a predator who had finally cornered his prey. Congratulations, kid. You just ruined your life. They marched her down a narrow hallway, past rows of cells filled with people in orange jumpsuits. Some stared at her. Others didn't even look up. When they reached the last cell, an officer unlocked the door and shoved her inside so hard she almost tripped. The door slammed shut with a deafening clang. The room was small, the air stale, the single bed stained with something dark. Jada backed against the wall, her eyes scanning the graffiti etched into the cement. They never listen. We all look the same to them. No justice here. Her throat tightened. Her hands trembled. This was real. She was alone, and the system wasn't built for her to win. Jada stood in the middle of the courtroom, drowning in the oversized orange jumpsuit, the fabric stiff and scratchy against her skin. It hung off her like a shroud, a deliberate way to make her look small, powerless, like she belonged in a cage. Her wrists itched where the cuffs had been. Her shoulders ached from the rough handling the night before, but she refused to let it show. The room was packed. Strangers filled the gallery, whispering behind cupped hands, their eyes darting between her and the prosecutor. Some shook their heads, already convinced she was guilty. Others watched with unreadable expressions. The weight of their judgment pressed down on her like a boulder. At the front of the room, Judge Harrison Calloway adjusted his glasses and exhaled loudly, like this whole trial was an inconvenience to him. His silver hair was slicked back, his face carved into deep, permanent lines of disinterest. He hadn't even looked at her yet. Not once. To him, she wasn't a person. She was just another case, another name on a docket. Jada's stomach twisted, but she forced herself to stand tall. Next to her, Leonard Davis, her so-called public defender, barely glanced up from his legal pad. His suit was wrinkled, his tie loose around his thick neck. He looked like a man who had given up years ago and was just going through the motions. The only person in the room who seemed to be enjoying himself was Daniel Mercer, the prosecutor. He was tall, lean, with a sharp jawline and a smile that was anything but friendly. His navy blue suit was crisp, his gold watch gleaming under the fluorescent lights. He looked at her like a wolf eyeing a rabbit. Jada knew his type. Men like Mercer didn't see people like her as innocent. To him, she was already guilty, and he was going to make sure the jury saw it that way too. Mercer stood, smoothing out his suit, and turned to the jury, his voice steady, his posture perfect, like he had rehearsed this 100 times before. Ladies and gentlemen, he began, pacing slowly. We are here today because this young woman, Jada Reynolds, committed a crime. She walked into Davidson and Company. Jewelry reached into a display case and took a sapphire necklace worth $12,000. A murmur rippled through the gallery. Jada's hands clenched into fists beneath the table. That's a lie, she muttered under her breath, but no one was listening. Mercer continued, his voice smooth, confident, like he was telling the absolute truth. The security footage clearly shows her at the scene, he said, turning to a large screen where grainy black and white video flickered to life. The footage showed the inside of a jewelry store. A hooded figure stood at the glass counter, reaching inside. Their face was mostly obscured, their movements quick. It could have been anyone. But Mercer didn't care. There she is, he said, pointing at the screen. He said it with so much certainty that some of the jurors nodded along, already convinced. Jada felt her heart hammer in her chest. They couldn't actually believe this was proof, could they? Furthermore, Mercer went on, we have an eyewitness who saw her fleeing the scene. The door to the witness stand opened, and an older man with salt and pepper hair shuffled in. His suit was worn, his eyes darting around the room nervously. State your name for the record, Mercer said, smiling like a man who already knew the answers to every question. The man cleared his throat. Dennis Patterson. Mercer nodded, walking toward him. Mr. Patterson, you were working at Davidson and Company on the night of the theft, correct? Yes, sir. And you saw the defendant near the store? Mr. Patterson hesitated, just for a fraction of a second. Jada caught it immediately. Yes, he finally said. I saw someone who looked like her running from the store. Another murmur from the gallery. Jada's stomach twisted. That's not the same as seeing me steal something. Mercer nodded like this was exactly what he wanted to hear. He turned to the jury, his voice dripping with confidence. Ladies and gentlemen, this is not a complicated case. We have video evidence. We have a witness. We have a stolen necklace. The facts are clear. Jada gritted her teeth. They weren't facts. They were lies wrapped up in pretty words. Leonard Davis cleared his throat and stood up slowly, like a man with nowhere else to be. He looked down at his notes, flipping through the pages without urgency. Then, without even looking at Jada, he muttered, Your Honor, my client is a child. She has no criminal record. Judge Calloway barely reacted. He just stared at Davis like he was wasting his time. Mercer smirked, shaking his head. That's not a defense, counselor. Davis sighed, nodding. Right? Well, the footage isn't completely clear, is it? That was it. That was all he said. Jada felt rage bubble up in her chest. That's your defense? That's all you've got? Mercer didn't even try to hide his amusement. The footage is clear enough, he shot back. It shows her at the store, reaching into the case. What more do you need? Davis scratched his chin, looking bored. I don't know. Maybe. The necklace? Do you have it? The room went silent for a beat. Mercer's jaw tightened just slightly before he recovered. No, but that doesn't change the fact that, no further questions, Davis interrupted, already sitting down. Jada stared at him, her blood boiling. That was it? That was all he was going to do? She looked around the room. The jury wasn't looking at Davis anymore. They were looking at Mercer. Because he was the one leading this case. Davis wasn't even trying. He was letting her lose. She had been thrown to the wolves. She had always believed that if you were innocent, the truth would set you free. That justice was real. That if she just told her side of the story, people would believe her. But this wasn't about truth. This was about winning. And Mercer was winning. Davis had already accepted defeat. Judge Calloway was already convinced she was guilty. The jury? They weren't sure yet. But if things kept going this way, they wouldn't hesitate to convict her. Jada sucked in a slow, steady breath. She wasn't going to let that happen. If no one else was going to fight for her, she would fight for herself. What would you do if the system was stacked against you? Jada is only 14, but she's already facing a courtroom that sees her as guilty before she even speaks. How does this make you feel? Angry? Frustrated? Worried for her? If you believe in justice, hit that like button to show your support for Jada. The fight isn't over yet, and she won't go down without exposing the truth. Stay with us, because in the next part, Jada takes control and turns the courtroom upside down. Don't miss what happens next, keep watching. Jada's pulse thundered in her ears as the courtroom settled into a tense silence. The air felt thick, like she was drowning in it, but she refused to let it choke her. Her hands were clenched beneath the table, nails digging into her palms. Her lawyer wasn't going to fight for her, so she would fight for herself. She lifted her chin and spoke, her voice cutting through the courtroom like a blade. "I want to see the video again." The words hung in the air, bouncing off the wooden walls of the courtroom. There was a moment of complete silence before Judge Calloway let out a slow, condescending chuckle. "Oh, she thinks she's a lawyer now," he muttered, shaking his head. His gaze finally met hers, but it was filled with amusement, not respect. Jada's stomach tightened, but she didn't flinch. Mercer, still standing at the prosecution's table, let out a breath through his nose and smirked. "You've already seen it," he said, like he was speaking to a child. "I want to see it again," Jada repeated, her voice steady. A ripple of whispers ran through the jury box. They weren't used to a defendant speaking up, especially not a 14-year-old girl in an oversized orange jumpsuit. Judge Calloway sighed, rubbing his forehead. "Fine. Bailiff, play the footage." The screen flickered to life again, and the grainy black and white video played for the second time. Jada leaned forward, every muscle in her body focused. The hooded figure in the footage moved toward the jewelry counter, reached inside, and then "Pause it," Jada said. The bailiff hesitated but looked toward the judge. Calloway shrugged. "Humor her." The footage froze. Jada stood, her heart hammering against her ribs. She took a slow step toward the screen and then pointed. "Look at the left hand." The room shifted. Jurors squinted at the image. Calloway's eyebrows drew together slightly. "What about it?" Mercer asked, his voice laced with impatience. Jada took a slow breath. "The person in the video is wearing a ring." She lifted her hands and held them up for the entire courtroom to see. "I don't wear rings." The tension in the room shifted almost instantly. One of the jurors, a middle-aged woman with sharp eyes, leaned forward. Mercer scoffed, but it wasn't as confident as before. "That proves nothing. Maybe you took it off." Jada didn't blink. "Or maybe the person in the video isn't me." A murmur rippled through the jury. Jada turned back to the screen. "Rewind it a few seconds," she said. The bailiff did. The footage jumped backward, then played again. "Now, look at the feet," Jada said. Calloway tilted his head slightly. "Explain." Jada pointed. "The person in the video, the way they walk, it doesn't match me. Watch their stride. It's different from mine." Another wave of murmurs. The middle-aged juror was now whispering to the person next to her. Jada turned toward the judge. "If you compare that to the footage from when I was arrested, you'll see the difference." For the first time since the trial began, Judge Calloway actually looked interested. The doubt was spreading. Mercer's jaw was tight now. He could feel the case slipping, and he wasn't about to let a 14-year-old girl make a fool of him. His expression darkened. He turned to the judge. "Your Honor, this is a classic misdirection. She's trying to confuse the jury with details that don't matter." Jada didn't let him finish. "They don't matter?" she repeated, stepping toward him. "Are you saying evidence doesn't matter?" Mercer's nostrils flared. "I'm saying this little game you're playing won't change the fact that you fit the description. You were arrested a few blocks away. A witness saw you." Jada's breath came fast, but she forced herself to stay calm. Mercer took a step closer, towering over her. His voice was low, mocking. "You think you're smart, little girl?" The words slammed into her like a punch. A sharp silence filled the courtroom. Jada felt the burn of humiliation creep up her neck, but she refused to shrink under his gaze. Judge Calloway didn't even react. Jada realized, in that moment, that he was allowing this. Allowing Mercer to intimidate her. Allowing this trial to be a performance, not a pursuit of truth. She swallowed down her frustration and met Mercer's eyes head-on. "I don't think I'm smart," she said quietly. "I know I am." A murmur swept through the gallery. Mercer's jaw tightened. Jada turned back to the jury. "Let's go over the facts again," she said. She walked toward them, standing tall despite the oversized jumpsuit. 1. There is no clear footage of my face. A few jurors nodded. 2. The person in the video is wearing a ring. I don't wear rings. More nods. 3. The suspect's walk doesn't match mine. The whispers grew louder. Jada felt a spark of something she hadn't felt since this nightmare began. Control. Mercer's hands curled into fists. She was winning, but he wasn't done with her yet. Mercer forced a chuckle, shaking his head. "You're putting on quite the show," he said, his voice coated in sarcasm. Jada stared at him, her expression unreadable. Mercer turned to the jury. "This girl, this child, is trying to outsmart the justice system. She's twisting details, hoping you'll forget the bigger picture." He looked back at her. "You're a kid. You don't know how the law works." Jada's heart pounded, but she refused to let him see her crack. She turned to Judge Calloway. "Your Honor, would you like me to recite the exclusionary rule?" she asked, her voice steady and clear. A flicker of something, annoyance? Amusement, crossed Calloway's face. "Go ahead." Jada didn't hesitate. "If evidence is obtained illegally, it cannot be used in court." Mapp v. Ohio, 1961. More whispers. Calloway rubbed his temple, exhaling through his nose. Mercer's face had gone red. Jada felt the shift in the room. People were listening to her now. For the first time, she wasn't just the accused. She was the one in control. The air in the courtroom shifted as the next witness took the stand. Dennis Patterson, the store employee who claimed to have seen Jada, shuffled forward, his movements stiff and uneasy. The man looked like he didn't want to be there. He kept wiping his hands on his pants, darting nervous glances around the room. Jada watched him carefully. She had seen this type before, someone who got caught up in something bigger than themselves, someone who had been pressured into saying what they were told to say. Mercer stood confidently, smoothing out his suit as he approached the stand. His voice was steady, sharp. "Mr. Patterson," he said, "can you confirm that you were working at Davidson and Company on the night of the robbery?" Patterson swallowed hard. "Yes, sir." "And can you confirm that you saw the defendant, Jada Reynolds, inside or near the store on that night?" Patterson hesitated. It was slight, but Jada saw it. Then he nodded too quickly. "Yes," he said. "I saw her." Mercer smiled, turning toward the jury like he had just delivered the final nail in Jada's coffin. Jada's blood boiled. She could feel it in her bones. He was lying. Mercer continued, pressing forward. "Are you absolutely certain, Mr. Patterson?" Patterson's throat bobbed as he swallowed again. "Yes," he said, but his voice was quieter now. "I saw her face." The words hit Jada like a slap. The jury shifted. People in the gallery leaned in. It was a powerful accusation, but it was also a lie. Leonard Davis, her so-called lawyer, remained slouched in his seat, flipping through pages he clearly didn't care about. Jada clenched her fists. She had had enough. She pushed back her chair and stood up. "Can I ask him a question?" she said, her voice cutting through the tension in the room. The judge's eyes snapped to her, his lips pressing into a thin line. Mercer scoffed, arms crossing over his chest. "This isn't a game, Miss Reynolds. Sit down." But Jada didn't sit down. She turned her attention to Patterson. "You said you saw my face," she said, her voice steady despite the fire burning in her chest. Patterson shifted. "Yes." Jada nodded slowly, then tilted her head. "What color was the hoodie?" Patterson blinked, caught off guard. "Excuse me." "The hoodie," Jada repeated. "The one the person was wearing in the video. What color was it?" Patterson hesitated. Then he cleared his throat. "Gray." A ripple of whispers spread through the courtroom. Jada turned to the jury. "You all saw the footage. What color was the hoodie?" The answer was clear. It was black. One of the jurors, a man with salt and pepper hair, leaned forward, brow furrowed. Patterson's face drained of color. I might have been mistaken," he muttered. Jada's heart pounded. She wasn't done yet. "And when you saw the person run," she continued, "where were you standing?" Patterson hesitated again. Behind the register." "So the person was already outside when you got a look at them?" "Yes." Jada took a slow step toward the jury. Her pulse raced, but her voice was steady. "So you never actually saw them take anything?" Patterson's breathing grew shallow. "Well, no," but Jada cut him off. "But you assumed." The words hung in the air like a bomb waiting to explode. Mercer's jaw tightened. The jurors exchanged glances. They saw it. They saw the crack in the case. Patterson hadn't seen her. He had seen what he expected to see. He had filled in the blanks. Jada turned toward Mercer, her eyes burning with fury. "This is the state's key witness?" she asked. Mercer's mouth pressed into a tight line. The courtroom buzzed with murmurs. Jada could feel it. The tide was turning. She was winning. And that was when the judge slammed his gavel. "Enough," Judge Calloway snapped. His voice was sharp, final. Jada whipped her head toward him, her chest rising and falling fast. "You are not a lawyer, Miss Reynolds," Calloway said, his face a mask of irritation. A heavy silence settled over the courtroom. Jada knew what was happening. Calloway saw what she was doing. He saw how the jury was beginning to doubt, and he was trying to stop it before it went any further. But Jada wasn't about to stop. She lifted her chin, her eyes locked onto his. "Then prove me wrong." The entire courtroom stilled. A breathless pause, thick with tension. Calloway's nostrils flared. "This is a courtroom, not a debate hall," he said, his voice dangerously low. "You do not get to play games with the law." Jada didn't blink. "I'm not playing anything. I'm proving that the witness is unreliable." Calloway's fingers curled against the bench. "Sit down." Jada stayed standing. Her legs felt like they might give out beneath her, but she refused to break. She turned back to the jury, her voice clear and unwavering. "This case isn't built on facts," she said. "It's built on assumptions. On a witness who admitted he didn't see me inside the store. On footage that doesn't show my face. On a prosecutor who wants you to believe I'm guilty just because I fit the description." A heavy silence. The words hung in the air, sinking into the jury's minds. Calloway let out a slow breath. Then he turned to Mercer. "Counselor, do you have any further evidence to present?" Mercer hesitated. Jada saw it. Everyone saw it. No necklace. No fingerprints. No real proof. He had nothing. Mercer's eyes darkened, his lips pressing into a hard line. "We have enough," he muttered. But now, no one was sure. Jada felt her heart pounding, the adrenaline coursing through her veins. For the first time since this nightmare began, she had made them question everything. The system tried to silence her, tried to intimidate her, but Jada refused to back down. She proved that the witness was unreliable. She exposed the prosecutor's case as weak. And now, for the first time, the jury wasn't looking at her like a criminal. They were looking at her like someone who might be telling the truth. But the fight isn't over. Mercer isn't done. And in the next part, the final showdown begins. Will Jada walk free? Or will the system crush her before she gets the chance? Stay with us, because the truth is about to explode. The courtroom felt different now. The jury was no longer fully convinced by Mercer's performance. The weight of the case was shifting, the air crackling with something that hadn't been there before, doubt. And Jada was about to crush what was left of Mercer's argument. She turned, standing tall, despite the oversized jumpsuit swallowing her frame. Her heart pounded like a drum, but her voice stayed steady. "Where's the missing necklace?" The words echoed through the courtroom, cutting through the thick tension like a razor. Mercer's smirk faltered. A flicker of something, panic, uncertainty, crossed his face before he masked it. "We don't need the necklace to prove the crime," he said smoothly, but there was something off in his tone. Jada tilted her head, studying him. "Don't you?" she asked. "Because theft means taking something. And last time I checked, you can't steal what doesn't exist." The jury shifted. A couple of jurors exchanged glances. Calloway adjusted his glasses, rubbing his temple as if this entire case was starting to give him a headache. Jada pressed forward, her voice sharp, unwavering. "You've accused me of stealing something that's worth $12,000, she said, scanning the jury, letting her words sink into their minds. "And yet, in all this time, the necklace hasn't turned up. You searched my home, my school locker. You tore apart my life looking for it." She turned back to Mercer. "So where is it?" Mercer tensed, his lips pressing together into a tight, thin line. Jada saw it. The moment he realized he was losing control. The courtroom was silent now. No one moved. No one spoke. Even the judge looked at Mercer now, waiting for an answer. Mercer took a slow breath. Just because we haven't recovered the stolen property doesn't mean the defendant didn't commit the crime. Jada's fists curled at her sides. He was still trying to twist the truth. But she wasn't finished. Jada took a slow step forward. The cold courtroom air felt electric around her. "You're asking the jury to assume I'm guilty," she said, her voice stronger now, fueled by every moment of injustice she had faced. "Not because of hard evidence. Not because of facts. But because I fit the description." The words hung heavy in the air. The jury shifted uncomfortably. Jada turned, looking each of them in the eyes. She could feel their unease, their hesitation. She wasn't just another case number to them anymore. She was a person, a 14-year-old girl who had been dragged through hell without a shred of proof. She took a deep breath. "This system wasn't built for people like me," she said. "It was built against me." The gallery was so silent that Jada could hear the ticking of the courtroom clock. Even Calloway rubbed his forehead, as if her words had settled into his bones, making him rethink every ruling he had ever made. Minutes stretched into what felt like an eternity. The jury had been gone for what felt like hours. Jada sat at the defendant's table, her hands clenched into tight fists in her lap. She stared straight ahead, refusing to let her anxiety show on her face. But inside, she felt like she was being crushed. Her entire future hung in the balance. She had done everything she could. She had torn apart Mercer's case, exposed the truth, forced them to see her not as a criminal but as a human being. But would it be enough? The door creaked open. The jury filed back in. Jada's heartbeat roared in her ears. The foreman stood, holding a small slip of paper. The courtroom held its breath. Jada felt her entire body lock up. The foreman took a deep breath and read from the paper. "We, the jury, find the defendant." A pause. Jada gripped the edge of the table. "Not guilty." The words slammed into her like a wave. For a moment, Jada didn't move, didn't breathe. She just stared forward, letting the words settle into her skin, into her bones. Then, behind her, her mother let out a strangled sob. Jada's hands trembled as she let out a shaky breath. It was over. She had won. Mercer's face had gone stiff, his jaw clenched so tightly it looked like he was physically holding back a scream. He slammed his file shut, turning away from the jury, furious. Judge Calloway sat back, staring at Jada for a long moment. Then, for the first time, he gave her the smallest nod. Jada didn't smile. She didn't celebrate. She just stood up slowly, her body feeling heavy, drained, exhausted. The system had tried to break her. It had tried to steal everything from her, her freedom, her dignity, her future. And if she hadn't fought back, if she hadn't refused to stay silent, she would have lost. She turned, walking toward her mother. Angela pulled her into the tightest hug, her body shaking with relief. "We're going home," her mother whispered into her hair. Jada swallowed hard. Home. She had almost lost it all. And for what? A system that never wanted to give her a fair chance in the first place. Jada wins. But she was never supposed to. The system had tried to bury her, but she had forced them to see the truth. And now, she was free. But this wasn't just about her. This was about every person who had ever been thrown into a courtroom with the odds stacked against them. And she wasn't done fighting. Not yet. The air outside the courthouse felt different. It wasn't just the heat of the Alabama sun pressing down on her skin. It was the weight of everything that had just happened. Jada Reynolds had walked into that courtroom as a criminal in their eyes. She walked out as the girl who refused to be broken. But that didn't mean she had won. Because the system never wanted her to win. She took a shaky breath, stepping down the courthouse steps, the fabric of the oversized orange jumpsuit still clinging to her skin like a bad memory. And then, her grandmother's arms were around her. Regina Reynolds, her rock, her foundation, the woman who had taught her never to bow to injustice, pulled Jada close, holding her as if she was afraid to let go. "My baby," she whispered, her voice breaking. Tears slipped down her wrinkled cheeks, but there was fire behind them. "They tried to take you from me. Jada clutched her grandmother's back, burying her face into the warmth of her embrace. "I'm okay," she whispered. But she wasn't. How could she be? How could anyone be after what she had just gone through? Behind her, the courtroom doors slammed shut. She turned her head just in time to see Daniel Mercer, still gripping his files, his face twisted in silent rage. He had lost. But the way he looked at her, like she was a mistake he should have been able to erase, told her he wasn't going to forget this. The system didn't like being embarrassed, and she had just embarrassed it in front of everyone. Judge Calloway didn't even look at her as he passed. His robe swished behind him, his jaw clenched so tight it looked like he was holding back words he didn't dare say out loud. He knew what she had done. She had exposed them, their bias, their indifference, the way they had walked into that courtroom expecting an easy conviction, because that was what always happened to kids like her. But not this time. Not this time. They reached the car, her mother already waiting inside. Angela's face was tired, her eyes rimmed red with exhaustion, but there was pride there too. Jada slid into the passenger seat, her hands resting on her lap. Her grandmother settled in beside her, the car silent except for the soft hum of the engine. For a moment, no one spoke. The trial was over. She was free. But Jada couldn't shake the feeling that something was still unfinished. She turned to Regina, her voice barely above a whisper. "What about the next black kid?" she asked. Her grandmother's brow furrowed. "What do you mean, baby?" Jada stared at her hands, feeling the weight of the question pressing against her chest like a stone. "The next kid who gets arrested for something they didn't do," she said. "The next kid who doesn't know the law. The next kid who doesn't know how to fight back." The car went silent again. Regina took a slow, deep breath. Then, she reached over, placing a gentle but firm hand over Jada's. "Then it's up to you," she said. Her voice was steady, filled with something powerful, something unshakable. Jada looked up, meeting her grandmother's eyes. And in that moment, she understood. This wasn't just about her. It had never just been about her. Her story wasn't unique. How many black kids had sat in holding cells, scared and alone, just waiting for someone to believe them? How many of them didn't get the chance to fight back? Jada had won her case, but how many others had lost theirs? She clenched her jaw, her fingers curling into fists. She had spent days trapped in a cage, treated like a criminal, abandoned by a system that had already decided her fate before she even walked into that courtroom. And if she had let them break her, if she had stayed quiet, stayed small, let them drown her out, she would have been just another name lost in the system. No, she wouldn't let that happen. Not again. Not to anyone else. Jada exhaled slowly, turning to look out the car window. The courthouse loomed in the distance, a cold, lifeless building made of concrete and quiet corruption. How many more kids would walk through those doors? How many of them would never walk out? Her stomach twisted. She had been one wrong move away from losing everything. And that wasn't justice. That was a system designed to crush people like her. But she had fought back. She had forced them to see her, to hear her. She had proven that the truth still mattered, even when the system tried to bury it. And if she could do it, maybe she could teach others to do it too. Her fingers tightened around the fabric of her jumpsuit. It wasn't over. It would never be over. Not until every kid like her knew how to fight back. Not until the system had no choice but to change. She turned back to her grandmother, a new fire burning in her chest. "I want to help," she said. "I want to make sure this never happens to anyone else." Regina smiled, a slow, knowing smile, one filled with quiet pride. "Then we start today," she said. Jada nodded, her heart steady now. Because she wasn't just a girl who had won her case. She was a girl who was ready to change the world. Jada's story isn't just fiction. It's a reflection of a reality that happens far too often. How many kids just like Jada, have sat in cold courtrooms, powerless against a system that had already made up its mind? How many of them didn't know their rights? Didn't know how to fight back? Didn't have a voice loud enough to be heard? How many were swallowed whole by a system that was never designed to protect them? Jada won. But she wasn't supposed to. She was supposed to be just another statistic, another name in a file, another life derailed before it ever truly began. But she fought back. And because she did, the system had to answer for itself. The truth is, most people in Jada's situation don't get that chance. They don't get to stand up in court and dismantle the lies built against them. They don't get to demand to see the evidence, to question the witnesses, to force the jury to see the truth. Because most of them don't know they can. That's what the system counts on. It counts on fear. It counts on silence. It counts on the fact that most people don't know the law well enough to challenge it. But imagine if they did. Imagine if every kid, every teenager, every person who has ever been wrongly accused knew exactly how to fight back. Imagine a world where the system couldn't rely on assumptions, couldn't count on people just accepting their fate, couldn't get away with convicting innocent people just because they fit the description. Imagine if the next Jada didn't have to face it alone. That world is possible, but only if we fight for it. Justice isn't something that just exists. It's something we have to demand, something we have to protect. And it starts with knowing your rights. It starts with learning the law, not just for yourself, but for others. Because the more we know, the harder it is for the system to work against us. So if you felt something while watching Jada's story, if you were angry, frustrated, heartbroken, then don't let that feeling disappear. Let it drive you. Hit that like button right now to show your support for Jada and for every person who has ever had to fight for their freedom. Share this video. Spread the message. Make sure people know that this is real and that it needs to change. And most importantly, subscribe to the channel. Because this story is just the beginning. We're going to keep telling these stories. We're going to keep exposing the truth. We're going to keep fighting. And we need you with us. Because the war isn't over. And the fight for justice needs all of us. Subscribe now. Stand with Jada. Stand for the truth. Because the next fight is coming, and we're ready.